the title of my talk today, what is a PWA and why you should or shouldn't build one. It kind of expanded from there, but we'll say that's what the title is for now. So a bit about myself. My name is Adam Berg. We'll go kind of chronologically here from the bottom. So I graduated from UBC with a computer engineering degree. Since then, I've kind of done a variety of projects and worked at a variety of companies. So the Student Leadership Conference, this was a student-led conference. I built the registration website for that in Django. This is my final project in the engineering program. This is an instrument builder that you could then upload to your phone, and then the phone would have those, and you could kind of play an instrument using that. This was built using this thing called OpenFL, which is built using the HAX programming language. Very few people, I think, have actually heard of that. But it's kind of like one of the early multi-platform solutions, particularly when Flash died. So speaking of Flash, actually the first company I worked at, iRock2, I was a co-op there, and was building a Flash game there. It's kind of a Guitar Hero clone for Facebook, and you'd play Guitar Hero to YouTube videos. And then they eventually went under, but I had a few months left with them while that project went out of fashion. And so I just got to hack around building some mobile apps with Adobe Air, which was kind of the Flash attempt to get into the mobile scene. And then after that, my next job was at this, well, let's go chronologically. So bumping up here to this isolated. This was just a personal project of a game that I built, also using Flash. I kind of fell in love with Flash during this period, which if you know where that ended up, it's kind of unfortunate. And then went on to Iogo. They were building apps for kids and for health. So particularly I was working on a project in the Unity game engine to help kids track and reward them for tracking their diabetes measurements, so glucose. That was Unity. And then let's see what's the correct order here. And then I went on to work at FIFA at EA Sports. This is after I graduated from university. I worked on the story mode. If you've played the FIFA series, C++ for their back end, and then I did a decent bit of front end work there, which was ActionScript 2. And then I'll get back to Dubsado at the end. Then there's another company here in Vancouver called Clear. They're doing, how should I describe it? Renewables, monitoring, tracking, and performance improvements. And so this is where I probably started using React and Redux the most. And then that kind of leads me to where I am now. So currently I'm CTO at Dubsado. We previously were AngularJS, but we're in the middle of a transition to React. And as well, we're kind of starting to lay out how we're going to move into the mobile app space, which is kind of part of what leads into this talk. And then kind of the one we'll talk about most today is this logo here that doesn't have a name. This is a project that I've been working on, and today's talk will mostly focus on it because I've been using it to kind of experiment with different mobile app options. So what are we going to talk about? Just going to give a quick overview of what a PWA or progressive web app is. I'd be curious to know if people in the audience do know what a PWA is. Unfortunately, I can't ask people to raise their hands because we're not in a live audience. But feel free to raise your hand virtually if you like. I won't spend too much time here because I think it's pretty known for people. Thank you, Adam. And then most of what I'd like to do is kind of just do a demo of the app and then the corresponding code to what supports some of this PWA functionality. So a progressive web app is essentially a web app. It's really just a fancy term for the ability to install an app to your home screen. The main thing that enables this is a manifest file, and with a few things on top of it, just by supplying that, the main mobile devices will recognize that and say, okay, cool, we're going to allow you to install this to your home screen. It'll show up with an app icon and pretty much looks just like a regular app. One of the other kind of core pieces of it that supports the functionality that makes it seem more like a native app is what's called a service worker. And so these are essentially JavaScript code that is allowed to run in the background, which is something that your typical web browser is not allowed to do. So on a phone, if you're in the browser, you can only run code while that browser is open. The service worker allows you to register to then run things in the background, which allows you to do all kinds of things. So some big ones, offline functionality is probably one of the biggest ones. If somebody has installed your app, the way an app usually works is you expect it to work whether you have an internet connection or not, which is obviously not how a browser works. So that's one of the key things. And then just a few other ones here at the end. IndexedDB is one of the newer ways to store data locally, which is essentially a whole SQL database in JavaScript itself. And I'll go over some code and how that looks in my project. Push notifications is kind of an interesting one, and you will hear a bit of a theme of this throughout this. But Apple has been very slow to accept and adopt progressive web apps. And for a long time, they have not allowed notifications to occur in a progressive web app. And there has not been much movement in that for a while. So if this is something that you need in your project, then that's maybe not the option for if you're looking to support iOS. Say it again for people in the back. I will say it again at the end of this talk, so it'll be there. But interestingly, in Dubsado, we have actually built this out to support for. It also works for desktop as well. So you can get desktop notifications as well as Android notifications, and those work basically as you would expect. And then a couple interesting ones that I actually don't hear many people talk about are web share and web share target. And I will talk about how those work and what those do. So that's just a little bit of a primer. If you have questions about a PWA, feel free to ask them, and then we can get to those. But for now, I'll dive right into Engram. So Engram is a digital journal and planner that streamlines capturing the essence of a thought. An easier way of putting that is I needed the smallest possible thing I could build that I would actually use, and that would be kind of a functional mobile app. But it does genuinely solve a problem that I consistently have, where I'm either out and about, or I just am at a computer and I have a thought, but I don't really know where that thought belongs. I've been a big Notion fan in terms of kind of work documentation, but Notion kind of forces you to have some kind of hierarchy to your thoughts. And instead, I wanted a place where my unhierarchical thoughts could go. So just as the thoughts came, I would just rapid fire these things into a place. And then from there, that would give me a chance to kind of assess and view or send those to where they need to go. And on the right here is just what the meaning behind the term engram. So engram is an actual word that is a hypothetical permanent change in the brain accounting for the existence of a memory or a memory trace. And that's exactly what I see the app kind of providing, is each one of these is essentially an engram. So it's just a note that is a memory trace of something that you would like to remember. So this is the app itself. You can see here at the bottom are kind of the main tabs of navigation. So you have notes, tasks, and events, and those just act as filters of the data that you're currently looking at. And then at the top, you have the date selected that you're viewing. So everything is a daily note by default. And that's kind of just day to day. You're kind of keeping a log of everything as it comes in. And if you're reading any of these, what I've done here, this is a demo account. I've kind of left breadcrumbs for myself for what I should be going over in this presentation, because I have a lot to cover and I probably would forget things. And so it kind of helps showcase what the app does, is it kind of helps bring organization to the chaos of how some minds work, particularly my own. So let me see how we're doing for time. I can skip that, that's not super important. Well, fine. So how this started was I was looking for the simplest thing to build, as I mentioned. And if this thing loads, if you can hear that, it's just the sound. To make those rainbows in my mind when I think of you sometime, and I want to spend some time with you, just the two of us. Oops. So that was kind of just the first concept that I had of the app, and I think building that was maybe a weekend, and since then it hasn't changed much, but I've still somehow spent a bunch of time on it. Which is a bit of a riddle in itself. Let's see, we will skip that. So then let's jump into kind of the PWA stuff. So as we're looking at this here, this is clearly a website. This is at this URL, and this operates as a website as you'd expect. And so on a desktop, progressive web app also applies, even though the term kind of sounds like it's primarily just for mobile apps. So here you can see open an Engram demo. I already have this installed as a progressive web app on my desktop. How you normally do that is you go to more tools and then create shortcut. And then it asks you to create a shortcut, it grabs the logo itself, and then you can set it to open as a window. But if I over that one. So now this is the exact same app, except now you can see it's running in its own window. And the benefit of this is you can see here it shows up as its own icon in your operating system. Particularly for this app, I found it really important because nowadays everything is a Chrome app. And so if you want to get somewhere quick, Chrome is not the place to go because you have 80,000 tabs open and finding the one that you need is impossible. So that is, let's see here. Shortcut, yeah. And then in order to support that, like I mentioned in the slides, the manifest is really where most of this is enabled, and the browser kind of takes care of the rest. So there's all kinds of more options that you can supply here. This is the app itself. I used Create React App to do, and that gives you a really good base to work off of, and I really recommend using that if you're starting a new project. But here you can see that it points to the different logos, and that's what will be used for either your iOS or your Android apps. And so just by having this, that enables that functionality on iOS and Android. And let us have a look at that here on iOS. So some more thing, we can open up This is, again, just a website in Safari. It could work here. The problem you would have is it's really inconvenient to deal with Safari for something that you're kind of constantly using. So on iOS, the share button, and right down here, you'll get an add to home screen option. Click that guy. It lets you change the name of it. It pulls the icon. Again, that icon's coming from this manifest, so you can supply whichever one you want. And then it shows up again here, just like an app. There's no app store, there's nothing, it's just ready to go. And then once I open it up, it technically counts as a separate instance of Safari. So you'll see that it logged me out. But if you were to log back in, let's see whether it is one couple of times. There we go. So then, now this shows up. It doesn't look like it's in the browser anymore, even though that's what's happening behind the scenes. This is really just Safari rendering it, but it's doing it like it's an app. Let's see, is there something else I wanted to mention on that? I guess while we're here, so another, it's hard to say what counts as a PWA functionality and what's just a JavaScript API, because I think they've kind of become intertwined as the same term. And so one thing that you can do is share, and that will pop up the native share menu. And so here you can see the text, and you can send that as text to somebody else, or whatever options are available to share, which is quite handy, particularly for this case. And so that looks like in code. It's actually extremely easy. The Navigator API just has a share function, and you can pass the text that you want to share. The rest is handled for you. You just have to make sure that it exists, and if this thing exists, then the platform supports it, and it's good to go. So that is share. Down to the manifest, array, iOS. Okay, what else? I wanted to show IndexedDB. So let's go back to the desktop one. So I mentioned an offline mode. This is one of the probably more complicated aspects of building a PWA. So in Engram, I've decided to support an offline mode where you don't need to log in and no data actually gets stored on a server. So you click that button. I have caching, which means that it stays there. So here, you can not be logged in. You can still have all kinds of notes, and then those will be stored within your browser. But those will also persist across browser sessions, which is obviously a requirement for an app like this and kind of any kind of an app. And so how that works is through the IndexedDB API. And like I mentioned earlier, this is essentially an SQL database that runs in the browser. And so you can define your different collections that you're going to have. And then as well, you have a key that you specify, and then the shape of the object. So here you can see these are my encrypted notes, so you can't actually see the body. But something like here, you can see the body. And so then how that looks in code is, let's see if I remember db.tx. This was probably one of the more difficult things to get set up and kind of learn. So here I'm using the IDB library. This is a library built by Jake Archibald, who is a pretty big name in the PWA world. I think he works for Google, if I have followed correctly. But he essentially built just a really small library on top of IndexedDB, and that makes it much easier to operate with IndexedDB. And then here's where we actually open that database. And then, let's see, that's the interface. We get already where we supply the shape of the objects. Oh, that's right. It doesn't actually care about the shape of the object. You can instead supply it the indexes you want it to create, but it somewhat treats it like a NoSQL database where you can supply just a JSON object to it. And so then here the object stores are kind of like the tables in that database itself. And you then specify the key that you want to use. The other tricky part is if you're changing your database schema, you have to use the upgrade in order to manage the different schemas. So here you can see I've done this once, where if my old version is different, then it needs to upgrade to the new one, which means it's going to create the stores, create the index. And then here you can see in version 2, I added a new table. And so then here in that case, it upgrades to that. And this is to support the fact that people who have downloaded your PWA, if they don't go online, they're not going to get the updated code. And so somebody could easily be several database versions behind, and you need to keep every single upgrade inside your code in order to handle that. So that is IndexedDB, and this is what allows things to be stored offline. So here I have functions to add notes, for example, and this gets added straight to the database. And then, for example, I have a get all notes here, which then returns directly from the IndexedDB instead of hitting the server. The other thing that I found interesting and useful with this is even if you have a server backend, it's significantly faster to operate with your data locally. And so pretty much what I do is as I add notes, even if I'm connected to the internet, I'll just add it locally and then wait until the local request succeeds, which is probably maximum a couple milliseconds. And then I'll just treat that as it's good, even if the server response hasn't completed yet. And so this gives the UI a really quick movement because it's not waiting on a network request. And then if the network request failed, you still have a local copy that could then be synced up at a later time. So that is that. Take a look at my notes to see how I am doing here. I think that covers some of the main stuff I wanted to talk about in terms of PWA specific stuff. What I decided to do, so I built this as a PWA to kind of experiment with how that works and if it's going to be a viable option. In order to kind of understand whether that made sense, I felt I had to also explore the native routes to kind of get a proper comparison. And so on the left here, you can see this is a Swift UI application that looks relatively close. I don't know if funny is the term, but I built this anticipating that this is something that I would actually release in the App Store until I got to a place where I was almost done. And the only in production would the app would crash basically anytime you added a piece of information, which, as far as I could trace down, was just related to the core data library. And I eventually kind of aborted just because of that. And what was frustrating is that I had followed pretty much exactly a tutorial from Apple on how to build this. And so having that happen without much information as to like what the error was actually from kind of put me off of that route. And then on the right here, this is still in the web one. So once I aborted this, I decided to try out the React Native option because that's obviously quite popular these days. And so I also used the Expo library, which kind of builds up a framework above React Native even. And so this is the option that I have currently stuck to in terms of coming towards an actual proper mobile app that will find its way onto the App Store. So this is logged into the same account. You can see a lot of the same concepts exist here. One of the new things that was added is a time picker here. And the benefit here is that it's the actual native time picker that you get access to because you're using React Native. And I think I'm getting towards the end of my time here. So let me see if there's other things I would like to go over. I think that's okay there. So, some concluding thoughts. I think that was kind of a lot, and I tried to condense it into 20 minutes, and here we are. So, based on going through that, I still kind of believe that PWAs are the route that we should end up on, but I don't think that we're quite there yet. So, the reason I decided to build a native app, partially, yes, was just to kind of experiment, learn, but also because if I send a link to a website to my grandparents, for example, they're not going to know how to install that to their phone. Even though it's a few steps, that's a few steps more than they are used to. And as well, the App Store is the current place where people go to search for something like this. And so in terms of discoverability, you're also kind of limited in that sense. But kind of some of the benefits that you do get with the PWAs, which is why I'm hoping that that kind of becomes the future, is mainly just the ability to finally truly build your app once and not kind of in a hacky way. Or like React Native, yes, you build it once, but I've already run into all kinds of issues with that. For example, the Apple IPA build that ends up coming out of that by default is about 200 megabytes large, which is insanity. Whereas the PWA app that I've built is maybe 2 megabytes that a person you don't even notice that a download is happening at that size. And as well, time has already proven that the web is here to stay. There's no question about it. And so there's no risk. Whereas eventually, I don't think React Native necessarily dies, but the tool chain starts having problems. There's new stuff that gets added to the native platforms that it starts losing track of. Whereas the web will continue along as it is, and including Apple mobile devices will have to learn to accept that. Let's see, Santiago says my sound is nice, but hopefully it's getting better. I think my laptop is at its limits of what it can handle. So yeah, white native apps obviously still have their place. Notifications is probably the biggest one currently. And then quicker access to new APIs. So these platforms are going to continue to add new functionality, and you're going to get that stuff first when you actually have something native. And like I mentioned earlier, familiarity for consumers is more where that's targeted at. Is most people are used to how they access the App Store and just used to that process in general, as well as how those apps tend to look. So if that's important to you, that is important. So if you're in this realm of deciding what does the road ahead look like, the first thing, just like any kind of engineering project, start with your requirements. So figure out what it is that you are trying to or need to build, and just lay those out first. Forget what tools you're talking about. And then remember that the hardest part is figuring out what you are trying to build. So build the thing that is easiest to get something out the door first. In my example here, building a just React web app was the easiest thing for me, and so I did that. And then as soon as I had issues with iOS, for example, I was like, okay, let's just move straight to React Native. And that has helped me push through certain blockers in order to get to a point where I have a minimum viable product that I can then put out there. You can always change where you've gone from, but if you haven't actually started or gotten anywhere, then you're stuck, basically.
What was the moment for you that made you decide to go out and start up your own kind of technology business? Because I know that that's a pretty big leap, doing like, right, I'm doing it myself. What was that light bulb for you that made you decide, you know what, I'm going to go out and give this a try?
I guess it depends which one you're talking about. Dubsado, I will answer that one because I think that makes the most sense. At the time, I was working at FIFA, and I've been there maybe a year and a half, and you kind of, particularly with FIFA, it literally is the same thing every year. Like, it's FIFA, it's always going to be FIFA, and so there's an aspect of that. But as well, I was interested in learning new things, and my brother, who's actually, I think, here in the chat, I assume the Jake there is the one. He's the one who started the company, and he gave me a call one day. We had kind of talked along the way. One day he gives me a call and says, I need help. We can do this. And we just went for it, and here we are. Did you find Expo locks you in? That's funny because last night I was playing around with some things, and I'm also having a crash issue with Expo, and so I tried ejecting because, amongst other issues, the Expo build for iOS won't install via Xcode. It will only install via TestFlight. So locks you in probably to some degree. I don't think I'm far enough in yet to know. But yes, I have tried. I think knowing it's an option is helpful for sure.